Experience the future of packaging and processing up close and in action. Explore groundbreaking innovations, engage with hands-on solutions, and connect with the experts transforming the industry. See how these advancements can revolutionize your products, production lines, and business. It all starts here. Don't miss out. Register today at packexpolasvegas.com/unpackedpod. You're listening to Unpacked with PMMI, where we share the latest packaging and processing industry insights, research, and innovations to help you advance your business. Hi, and welcome to Unpacked with PMMI. I'm your host, Sean Riley. Seeing food recalls in the headlines is always ominous for consumers. So pet owners who feed their pets raw foods were particularly spooked when news broke earlier this summer that some raw pet food brands were self-recalling because of a salmonella risk. Have no fear, Unpacked listeners. We reached out to Grace Danao from the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of Nebraska. Professor Danao walks us through what happened, the impact, and procedures like high-pressure processing that can be put in place to ensure something like this doesn't happen again. Let's have a listen. So with all the fancy introductions out of the way, welcome to the podcast, Grace.
Thank you for having me.
So before we dive into, what can be a little bit of a heavy topic, could we just get you to kind of give us a little bit of your background and tell us exactly what it is that you do?
Sure. So my name is Grace Danao. I'm a faculty member at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. I'm associated with the Department of Food Science and Technology and also its Food Processing Center. So at the university, I wear many hats. I'm your typical faculty member doing research and teaching. But at the same time, my third hat is really in university extension. And most specifically, I'm I guess they call like a value-added food processing specialist. That's a mouthful, but really I use my engineering skills to help small entrepreneurs or food manufacturers kind of bring their products to market. And so one of the things that we have at UNL is high-pressure processing. So I lead that laboratory.
Oh, that's really cool. I did not know that part of the kind of, it's almost like consulting as part of like a value add. That's very interesting. But on with the topic. So what has been happening in the news with raw pet food recalls? I've kind of followed it, so I've seen a little bit of it. But I guess if you could just give us, our listeners kind of a high level thing about what's happening with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, over the years, we've certainly seen growth in pet ownership and certainly pet parents, if you will, looking for different or newer kind of formats of pet foods. And so thus, we kind of come upon like some of the more minimally processed or raw pet foods out there. And some of these raw pet foods can literally be just the meat itself, served raw, if you will. Or sometimes, I guess as you scale up the process, you need to preserve the quality and the nutritional value of that raw meat product. So this then led to potentially, like say using HPP or other processing and preservation techniques so that you can deliver that food to a much wider region, much wider audience. And then sometimes, to extend the shelf life, you might also freeze dry the food product. What do you call this? After HPP.
No, that's fascinating. And I guess the thing that I don't understand that maybe you can help me and hopefully a listener who is as simple as I am is if it's raw pet food and it's going to like we see animals foraging in the woods and eating things raw all the time. How can the food have things in it that would harm them? Does that make any sense? Like if you're eating food that they would normally eat, how is it going to hurt them? Because how is it quote unquote gone bad when dogs, eat out of trash cans sometimes and things like that?
Yeah, definitely. So going back to like what we were talking about earlier, right? So we have raw meats being served now to animals. Either sometimes the meat itself, or it could be lightly cooked.
Mm-hmm.
But to keep it raw, the best preservation technique or pasteurization technique that you can apply is high pressure processing. And then after that, since a lot of consumers are more used to like the dry kibble, we introduced freeze drying after HPP as another way to kind of lower the water activity and maybe make that product more shelf stable, something that's, you don't have to keep refrigerated and can last a really long time. Now, granted, when we start talking about scaling up the process of making raw pet foods out there, whether or not it's just HPP or HPP plus freeze dry, when you think about raw meats, kind of like even for yourself as a human being, when you buy raw meat from the grocery store, that is a ready to cook product. So you would cook it for yourself to consume. And in this case, with raw pet foods, there's some pet owners, pet parents that prefer to feed it raw or minimally processed. So it doesn't get that cooking step that we normally use to kind of kill the salmonella, E. coli 0157, or the listeria in it. So I think this is the reason why we're seeing some raw pet food recalls, is because sometimes those products are potentially not processed enough from the get go, or they suffer from temperature abuse during distribution, if you will, or at the consumer end, they don't store the product properly. So then, if there's any salmonella left over in the product, that could grow throughout the shelf life of the product, and eventually, potentially, dogs or your pets may not necessarily get sick eating that, but when you think about people living in the home, that's a really big food safety risk for them. You may have kids that are small, they're tiny, they touch everything. Certainly, people let their pets kiss them and such. So, in order to kind of make sure that the pet food is safe, we want to make sure we use a process like HPP to pasteurize it, get rid of the salmonella and potentially other pathogens that are in the product.
Oh, okay. So it is more for the pet owner, the pet parent, the people in the house that that may be handling the food, or but it may not necessarily. I guess my fear when I saw it was might not necessarily harm the animals. Correct?
Correct. Yes. So I was actually at a conference recently, and one of the pet food manufacturers in there actually said, when you're making pet foods out there, it's almost like making infant formula. It has to be super duper clean because, this is the only nutrition that the pet is getting, but it's being handled by humans. And, people in the home may be immunocompromised, or like I said, you have children that are touching everything and they put their hands in their mouths. And so we want to make sure it's safe.
Interesting. Yeah, that the part I wasn't the part that I was confused by is, again, I have a dog and I've seen her eat some things that she absolutely should not eat. She has been perfectly fine afterwards. And that's where I got confused, because I was thinking if we're serving this raw, they should be okay with it. So I appreciate you clearing that up for me and making it that it is more for the people in the house and the pet owners and pet parents. So I guess, how does your research and your work at University of Nebraska Lincoln pertain to this? Like, how do you work around this type of stuff?
Yes. So I'm a food engineer by training, and I really take a look at different processes that we can use to kind of make food safe, not just for pets, but also for humans. And it just so happens that in the state of Nebraska, we have a lot of pet food manufacturers that use HPP or high pressure processing already. So, kind of linking and collaborating with them, that's led me to do some research projects on looking at the safety of the raw ingredients coming into making raw pet foods to begin with. And then looking at, well, if you choose to use HPP to pasteurize your food product, then how do you do that effectively? So kind of like looking at the balance of the cost of doing the HPP treatment, but then also making sure that at the end of the day, you still have a safe product. So we do a lot of validation studies. So kind of, we actually introduce the pathogens, the bad microorganisms into the product. Then we HPP it, and then we document and make sure that, yep, the way you're HPP is going to lead to a safe product.
Oh, fascinating. Now, is this common among universities, or is Nebraska Lincoln one of the people that are leading this? Like, this wouldn't be something I would think would be that common in terms of HPP. But again, this might just be because I'm not completely up to speed on it.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of really good subject matter experts and university extension specialists at the U.S. universities, and so some of them have specialized, let's say, in helping food manufacturers understand, let's say, the food regulations better, or get certified with HACCP or preventive controls, or just kind of looking at nutritional labeling, if you will, and stuff. So at the University of Nebraska Lincoln, we value food safety greatly, and we have a lot of subject matter experts on food safety topics. So we cover HACCP, we cover obviously process validation in my lab. We have somebody that does shelf life studies. We also have a wonderful group that looks at food allergen control programs and such. So yeah, I think this is not necessarily unique to the University of Nebraska Lincoln, but there's a lot of universities out there as part of their outreach and extension effort help food manufacturers.
So then I guess besides just your research and the work that you're doing back at the university, how else are you spreading sort of the word about, high pressure processing?
So most of the time, I work with HPP service providers or tollers. So if they get contacted by a company and, kind of asking about HPP, then, some of them would refer those companies to us and say, well, why don't you talk to the people over at the University of Nebraska Lincoln? They can give you some introductory information or even do some testing for you, certainly conduct your validation and shelf life studies. Now, but when it comes to, let's say, training the next generation, if you will, of food manufacturers or food engineers and food scientists out there, I definitely bring the topic of HPP into the classroom and also through some of our outreach efforts. So, for example, recently, we've had some undergraduate students do research in my laboratory, so they get exposed to HPP technology. But I also work with some high school students who are interested in preserving foods, especially those that need to be minimally processed or there's a desire to not over process them. So then I give them an opportunity to learn about HPP and incorporate it in some of their class projects.
That's really cool, particularly because we do so many of these podcasts that talk about how there's sort of a gap in our industry and in manufacturing and packaging and processing, how we have a generational gap in terms of we're losing so many of the people that have been doing it for so long, and we need workforce to fill that in. So that's really cool that you're getting out there and getting kids young and interested and knowledgeable about this industry that kind of keeps things moving. It was one of the few things during the pandemic, for example, that didn't really skip a beat because we had to continue to eat and use all the things that this provides. So that's a really cool aspect of your job there.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like when we start talking about young people not really knowing where their food comes from, right? Because like so few of them may have the opportunity to, let's say, go on the farm or understand, where they think they just kind of magically appear at the stores. But it's part of like, I think, the fact that I wear a university hat, professor hat, if you will, that, teaching is part of my job. It's really kind of teaching them that, when you go to the grocery store, read the package labels, look at this, let's say an HPP salsa versus a retorted or shelf stable salsa, then kind of it let them kind of start understanding. Well, how can I get salsa in two different formats, two different price points, two different kinds of quality, but then both of them are safe to consume.
Yeah, that's great. That's really, and I guess it does tie. You're an educator at first, so that does tie to it. So I guess the one thing we haven't really hammered home during this is what exactly are the benefits of high pressure processing. If I happen to come upon this podcast for the first time and was drawn to it because I saw University of Nebraska or I saw Raw Pet Foods, what exactly is great about high pressure processing?
So high pressure processing is a well documented pasteurization technique. We don't have to use super high temperatures in order to kill pathogens. Instead, what we do is we use super high pressures to do that. So there's a lot of science that go into it. So if you know a little bit of cell biology, you use pressures to denature the proteins in the microorganisms to the point that they're sublethally injured. They're like, oh my God, I've had this much stress, if you will. I don't know if I can continue to live after HPP. And so afterwards, for the most part, they continue to die, especially if there's acid in the food product or some kind of an antimicrobial. And then, eventually some of them do recover. So that's why it's a pasteurization technique, not a sterilization technique. But what's really great about it is HPP does not affect a lot of the components in your foods. For example, vitamins, minerals, some of the color pigments, they're not affected at all, whereas those are normally affected by high temperatures. So at the end of the day, you kind of end up getting an HPP treated product that tastes fresh, looks fresh. It retains some of its raw like qualities, but it's received the benefits of traditional pasteurization in the sense that it's killed the pathogens and also some of the spoilage microorganisms.
Really cool. So, okay, I'm starting a company. I'm a new, I decided I'm going to bring to market my family recipe that I want to get out there, and I want it to be sold in stores. I'm I'm an emerging brand. How would I even get started with using something like this on my product?
So definitely you can reach out to, the university. So some of the extension services out there.
Hmm.
You can also, by looking online, you can find some of the high pressure processing service providers or tollers. And by reaching out to them, they can give you some introductory information and hopefully connect you with either a university specialist like me. And there's certainly also some private laboratories out there that do testing, whether or not it's process validation or shelf life studies. So that's how you would get started, is kind of doing your homework to figure out who's providing these HPP services. And then from then on, you start building your network on all the different companies and service providers surrounding that particular HPP service provider.
Perfect. And I'm going to have to go find something that I can bring to market that I can use HPP on. I just want to thank you again, Grace, for taking time out of what I assume is a very busy schedule over there at the University of Nebraska Lincoln to come on the podcast and kind of talk us through this situation with the raw pet food and the HPP. Please rate, review, and subscribe. To do that, go to the iTunes podcast or Spotify app on your phone and search for unPACKed with PMMI.